vara med i vacances. Moi aussi, je suis en vacances. Les vacances pour 2 octobre, on a dit hier. Juste pour voir.
Hello and welcome to another session of Nan's Niche on Channel 4. Today's program is about the relationship between the Bethel community and the National Training Laboratories. This is our 200th year celebration. It is the 50th summer that NTL has been here, but their actual birthday will be as they begin their 51st summer. However, as part of the Bicentennial Incorporation Week, the NTL and Bethel Area Task Force have combined to do a little retrospective celebration of that relationship at a lawn party at the Gehring House on June 11th, 1996. And this is how the announcement of the event looked. The Bethel Community and NTL Institute are celebrating their long history and special connection. Bring a friend and come join us for a lawn party on Tuesday, June 11, 1996, 3:30 to 5:30 p.m. at the NTL Founders House, which is the Gehring House at the end of Broad Street. Representing the Bethel community on the planning committee were Janet Stoll and Ken Bohr and others, with Kathy Schandelmeyer representing the NTL Institute. It was a lovely day, and we're about to see a listing of the people who participated in the program. The videography for this program was done by yours truly, Nan Timberlake of Nan's Niche. Now, at 3:30, people gathered, and they were welcomed by Gwyneth Bohr. The historical perspective was given by Dr. Stanley Howe, director of the Bethel Historical Society. Then, the history of Gehring, that is, of the house itself, the NTL Founders House, was done by Dick and Sally Taylor in reverse order. Then the panel discussion, which was somewhat moderated by Gwyneth, was, although she's not listed there as, but she did a very good job. Becky Bailey, a Bethelite. Richard Beckhard, who has been with NTL for some time. Barbara Douglas, a Bethelite. Gertrude Hutchins, a Bethelite. Henry Rieken, who has been with NTL or connected in some way since the beginning in 1947. And Dorothy Vale-Weber, who is the current dean, overall dean for this session that's going on right now. And
for coming and to welcome you on behalf of both of those groups. I'm simply the upfront person, kind of by default. And the people who really made this event possible are NTL's Kathy Schandelmeyer and Bethel's Jan Stoll. She was the chairman of the lawn party committee. So I want to ask Kathy and Jan and all of the committee to stand up so we can applaud them. Come on, Jan. Come on, Kathy. And there are members of the committee who are not here. And come on up front because you're being on a video, local video. They're the people who made the plans, who had the vision, and called us all together here. Ken, they want you up there, the committee.
Jan, Kathy, come on, Ken.
Okay. Give him a big hand. Oh, gosh. Thank you. Today is an example of the cooperation between NTL and Bethel. Both provided the vision and both provided the panel. NTL paid the bills, which is very nice. We like that. And Bethel provided the ambience and the audience. We're here to celebrate Bethel's bicentennial and to mark the 50th summer of NTL's presence here. They're going to celebrate their golden anniversary next year, but we think that we should mark their 50th summer. Certainly there have been some rocky times in the history of these two communities, but we don't want to think of that today. So rather let us rejoice in the continuing mutual support of NTL and Bethel, the mutual learning, and the good relations. May the good relations continue. Well, I thank you all for coming, and we will go on with our program. It includes the historical reflections by Bethel individuals and a panel of Bethel and NTL folks and audience participation. Then we'll have some time for refreshments and fellowship, which should be an interesting afternoon. Our first speaker is Dr. Stanley Howe, Executive Director of the Historical Society, I hope I have that right, lifelong Bethel resident. My husband said for many generations, but I don't think that's quite the way to introduce him. And he is also an NTL observer. So I don't know what kind of comments he's going to make about NTL, but here he is.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Gwyneth. William Faulkner said that history is not dead, is not even past. And I think with that in mind, let's think about this special spot in Bethel's history. It began as Dr. True's house and land, and it's very important to remember what Dr. True did for Bethel, because he was an innovator, a real mover and shaker of the town, and without Dr. True, Bethel would have been a very different place. The house we see here is not his house. His house was further back, and it burned in 1896, and they built this house for $8,000 in 1896 with a Portland architect. But what we do see from Dr. True's era, and I still see a couple of them here, are some of the old maples that Dr. True's students at Gould Academy planted. I think this is probably one of them here. I think one of them was removed earlier this year, but we still see a couple. I think there's one down by the gate. And Dr. True was as you know, was the founder of Gould Academy. He founded it in 1835, and became Gould Academy, Bethel Academy in 1836. It was Bethel High School before that. And he was one of those great innovators in education because he had been a medical doctor, but decided to devote his life to education. And he was one of those innovators because he believed in field trips. We think of field trips as a relatively old hat thing now, but in his era, field trips were very much a part of a new cutting edge of education. And Dr. True took his students out, particularly geological and Indian relics. He was very interested in both of those things, and ethnology and geology were two things that he was very interested in. And these students had a chance to go around Bethel and look at these things out in the wilderness and in the fields and wherever else they were found. And this was one of the things that made him such a special person. He was a devoted teacher, and he was a devoted headmaster. Unfortunately, when he came back again in 1848 and through his period until 1861, when he was fired by the trustees of the academy, apparently he wasn't a good disciplinarian. And so the trustees got tired of having to pay for all the damage that was done to the academy. Students are very unruly in this period, and so they finally fired Dr. True. Dr. True started, however, a school for boys up here and on these grounds, and so he continued that for several years, and then he finally moved on and lived in several other places. But he came back to Bethel. He never forgot Bethel, and Bethel was always very much a part of his life. And so he also had other things of interest for us too today. He was a pioneer in the scientific agriculture movement, which was a very much a very disruptive movement, I guess, in its early days. He had started out in the 1840s and 50s, becoming very interested in applying science to agriculture. And the dirt farmers, the so-called people that learned their farming from their forefathers, were not very happy about these book farmers, which are moving into Bethel. But nonetheless, book farmers would eventually take over, and as we know, the university system and all kinds of things would happen. The Grange would begin to occur. All these people interested in scientific agriculture would be here. He also was the founder of the Farmers Club in Bethel, and that was the first Farmers Club in Maine. And so this was another very innovative group. Men met in one room, women went in another. They usually had apples for refreshments. Sometimes they had suppers, but they discussed everything imaginable. Which was the best crop to grow in Bethel? What things would be best how barns should be designed to make them most efficient? All kinds of questions. And so he was always learning and always a very gifted teacher, as well as a person who we can really be proud of, because he was always learning and always interested in new ideas. He died in 1887, and his daughter, of course, took over the place here, and she lived here until her death in the 1930s. And of course, Marion True Gehring needs no introduction, as you all know her, because her name is immortalized in the building down here at Gould Academy. But without Mrs. Gehring, Bethel would have been a very different place, because she married as her second husband, John Gehring. You're going to hear more about him today, so I'm not going to talk much about him. But without Marion True Gehring, there wouldn't have been any William Bingham, and there wouldn't have been any Bethel as we know it today. So it's very important to keep that in mind, because the Gehring Clinic did attract people from all over the country, and it did encourage a lot of important people to come to Bethel and to know it well. And of course, one of the most important ones for what he did for Bethel was, of course, William Bingham II, who lived in the cottage right behind us here from 1922 until his death in 1955, every summer. Then we have NTL coming in the 1940s. It doesn't acquire this property until sometime in the 1950s, I believe. It wasn't the first years were spent at Gould Academy, but eventually it does acquire this property, and it has been here since the 1950s, and it's been a very important part of Bethel, as you all know. And so I think this property has a very special place. So every time I come up here, I always look for Dr. True's maples and think of the Gehring Clinic here, and then think of NTL. So it's a very important part from my point of view as we think of it in the bicentennial year, and I hope it's very important to you. And with that perspective, I hope I've given you some idea of how much it means to Bethel and to all of us here. Thanks.
Thank you, Stanley, for giving us that historical perspective. Our next speakers are Dick and Sally Taylor. Dick is a teacher at Gould Academy. They both run a bed and breakfast right down the street, and they're both history buffs. They gave an hour-long presentation at the Historical Society, and they've had the courage to cut it down to, 8 minutes or something like that for today. So thank you very much.
In 1921, Edna St. Vincent Millay wrote this poem, which is just a part of a poem I'd like to read to you. It says, "For the sake of some things that be now no more, I will strew rushes on my chamber floor. I will plant bergamot at my kitchen door." This poem of commemoration and loyalty speaks to us again today. We are gathered here in this lovely place to celebrate and to remember the Gehrings. Our costumes came from Broad Street homes and were undoubtedly worn to an occasion such as this on a June day, perhaps in 1915. Kid gloves were de rigueur. Most probably there was chamber music or poetry reading. We know that there were screened summer houses on the grounds, and that Dr. Gehring, who loved nature, made little lighted areas in his gardens to attract moths so that he could study them. Who were these people? John George Gehring was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1857 of parents who came to America from Germany. He received his MD degree in 1885 and began to practice medicine in Cleveland. But after 2 years, his family urged him to go to the Southwest for a rest in order to avoid a nervous breakdown. There in New Mexico, he met and became close friends with Mr. and Mrs. George B. Farnsworth of Massachusetts. Mrs. Farnsworth was the daughter of Nathaniel True, whom Stanley has just mentioned. And he was, as he said, for many years the headmaster of Gould Academy. Marion had grown up in Bethel, and she was born in 1850. The True home has burned, but it stood just behind us here. When the Farnsworths and Dr. Gehring returned to Bethel together in 1887, George Farnsworth lived just one more year. He'd been an invalid for some time, and he died. The next year, 1888, Susie Marion True Farnsworth married John George Gehring, and they moved into the True home at the end of Broad Street to raise chickens. They lived at first on limited financial circumstances. Dr. Gehring never got a medical doctor's license to practice in the state of Maine. However, his interest in hypnotism and autosuggestion and the cure of neuroses led him to graduate study in Berlin and the European clinics of that day. He was not accepted at first by the local people of Bethel. He was, in fact, considered a quack until a traveling hypnotist came to Bethel and gave a demonstration in Odeon Hall. He put to sleep the most vocal skeptic in the audience who had offered himself as a guinea pig. And he proved, the hypnotist proved beyond a doubt that this technique was possible. The guinea pig was laid out in a storefront window for the remainder of the afternoon. In 1896, the fire burned the True home, and this beautiful structure behind us was built. It became the Gehrings' home and the clinic. People came to be cured to this clinic from all over the country, because in spite of the local reception, Dr. Gehring had established a reputation, little by little, internationally and certainly nationally. People who came had to get up early, take a dip in the pools of Mill Brook, and tramp the woods and pastures until they were tired. Those physically able were put to work sawing wood. At night, the whole household dined at the big table with Mrs. Gehring at the head. It was not long before this success and the success of this sort of therapy attracted so many people to Bethel to be treated that the Bethel Inn would house the patients as well as neighboring homes, such as the Tools just down the road. William Bingham II came to Bethel in 1911. William Upson came soon after, and they so endorsed the cure and their friendship with Dr. Gehring that they both bought homes on Broad Street and spent the rest of their lives here, leaving their own marks on the community. Let me return to Mrs. Gehring, because Dick will speak about Dr. Gehring. Bethel was always so important to her. Marion, she preferred to be called, not Susie. And as a daughter of Dr. True, she was well educated and highly intelligent. As the wife of George B. Farnsworth, she had traveled a good deal in Europe and enjoyed a full and cultural and social life there, but she always returned to Bethel. Her role in the clinic was very important. She ran the house efficiently. There were always excellent cooks and servants. Only fresh fruits and vegetables were served. And she also ran the social schedule. Dinner at the Gehrings was a great occasion. I would refer here to the 1920 estate inventory, which has come to light. It listed Limoges china service of 25 dozen pieces. That, combined with the linens, which included 110 sheets and 36 dozen towels, might give an idea of the scale and elegance which existed here. And here is a description of an evening at the Gehrings, which was published in McClure's magazine in 1929. The guest-patients filled the long table, and a squad of servants served the meals. The conversation at those meals was doubtless as good and as brilliant as was ever heard at the salons of the greatest European intellectual leaders. For here were the brains and genius of our continent in a mood of confidential relaxation. Relaxed, but I might add, not entirely casual. Mrs. Gehring compiled a list of 17 1/2 subjects that were not to be mentioned at meals. The doctor required all of his patients to dress for dinner every evening. Many of the men objected to this at first. They said they had come to a country town for a rest. But the doctor insisted. He said, "Clothes help to create a mental state. You can depress your spirits and adversely affect your recovery from functional nervous disorders by dressing in a slouchy, dejected manner, as though you had given up hope." Mrs. Gehring was an elegant hostess in an age of innocence. She aspired to rise above her natural station and deigned to instruct others in the approved customs of higher rank. She wrote letters to the headmaster of Gould as to what the children should and should not be allowed to do. She held small afternoon teas here for the young students to practice decorum. Thus she eagerly strove to raise the intellectual tone around Bethel, and inevitably was resented by some as bossy and domineering. In later years, local people breathed a sigh of relief when the Gehrings got on the train for Florida in the winter.
This is Dick Taylor coming to the microphone now.
Despite their relief at seeing these folks leave for winter in Florida, it's hard to underestimate the impact that John George Gehring had on the area, and particularly Gould Academy, where he was a trustee for 40 years, the president of the Board of Trustees for many of them. His impact was great on the area, on the practice of therapeutic medicine, and above all on education. He evolved a vision of physical and psychological health with a combination of respect for human frailty and gentle spiritual zeal. His specific approach was highly original for his day, but it was also rooted in an American tradition of the wilderness frontier as a place of discovery, both of robust physical health and spiritual revitalization, a sort of combination of daring do and spiritual cleansing, of muscle strengthened and made moral and innocent in America's Gardens of Eden. That tradition is most profoundly exemplified by Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt gives us a handy compliment to Gehring, both because among Gehring's several thousand library volumes was a copy of Roosevelt's American Ideals, and because the two were in fact contemporaries. So we take a very brief detour. Teddy Roosevelt, if we can remember, was born in 1858, Gehring in 1857. It was the time when the transatlantic cable had just been laid. Both men were frail as young men, and both found means of overcoming it. At age 14 in 1872, Teddy Roosevelt had journeyed from his home in Long Island to Moosehead Lake in Greenville to take that wilderness cure, in a manner of speaking. On that trip was one of the seminal experiences of his life when he had been beaten up by a couple of older boys and decided at that moment that no longer was he going to be weak, he was going to become physically fit. And he started it there. He asked his father for permission to take up boxing and received it, and ever after became a lifelong advocate of robust exercise regimens, much like the patients marching hither and yon through these pastures under Dr. Gehring's tutelage. believer in the insights that came with clean air, the wisdom, and just simply the toughening aspects of the wild. It was a mixture of a vestige. It was a vestige of romanticism in many ways, the innocence of the Gardens of Eden, but in other ways, more practical ways, it had a profound effect on the actual day-to-day health of these people. In 1876, Teddy Roosevelt had gone to Harvard, where he continued his beliefs and his training under a man named Dudley Sargent, who was important to us as the first professor of physical education at Harvard, one of the founders of the American Association of Gymnasts. And for Dudley Sargent, and thence for Teddy Roosevelt, sports and games and competitive games were not only simply to win. That was rather secondary. The whole idea was teamwork. Athletic contests were moral exercises, almost morality plays in miniature. It was a truly ideological sort of education happening, if we can keep in mind, at the same time that John George Gehring was expanding his cures here. Another of Dudley Sargent's students, a man named Luther Gulick, ultimately founded the YMCA, and the Camp Wauhilo, just down here on Sebago Lake, brings that whole tradition very, very close to us from sort of another prong. It's interesting that the current head of the Board of Trustees at Gould, Al Ordway, sort of cut his teeth as a camper and counselor at Wauhilo, now has his own camp, and here he is back at Gould, talking in much the same way, I would imagine, as perhaps John George Gehring was talking another generation ago. Yeah. But at any rate, at the same time, in a similar type of experience to Teddy Roosevelt's, who in 1872 went to Moosehead Lake, when the Gehrings, or when John George Gehring went to New Mexico to visit and came to know the Farnsworth, it was 1887. If you can imagine, in the 1880s, Geronimo was still running raids in Arizona. It was really out there. You think of Geronimo a couple of hundred miles away, and it casts a sort of a particular glow on the experience of adventure, excitement, danger, and so on that all of these people were living through, and what they were trying to sort of cull together for themselves. But what's typical of both of these people, Roosevelt and Gehring, was they were unbelievably optimistic. They believed in the stabilizing philosophy in a period of absolutely explosive change, which is also hard to underestimate. A picture of what was happening. If you were born in 1857 or 58, as both of these people were, one would have lived through an era marked by the assassination of 3 American presidents, the impeachment of a 4th, a stolen election by a 5th. In the years between the Civil War and World War I, the nation admitted 12 new states, which doubled its geography, making it by 1912 the largest continental republic in the world. Americans voted on 10 different constitutional amendments, 7 of which were law by 1920. The country's population, number of foreign-born, suicides, industrial laborers, divorces, gross national product, and white-collar workers all doubled. In 1913, in addition, of the students in America's public secondary school, 57.5% would go home in the evening to parents who did not speak English. Given this wide diversity, while others, particularly educators, the National Education Association foremost, were trying to standardize and homogenize, Gehring was convinced and optimistic about preserving the values of diversity and difference which we so cherish today. In 1920, he wrote a book called Hope of the Variant, and I'll just give you 2 quotes from it to finish, which I think are remarkably visionary. He asked, what constitutes a variant? In some sense, all human beings are variants. None may look upon himself as being wholly distinguished, as symbolizing the perfect individual of his type. To vary in body, mind, and character potentials is our common attribute. And though we wander wider in the character of one or the other of our equipments, than is usual, yet such variations may be as valuable as are often a privilege and are always legitimate. Finally, we need to learn that in man, variation, even though to our feeble vision seemingly a barrier, is merely nature's eternal lure and invitation towards endless other fields of possible expansion. To John George Gehring, the variant human did not threaten chaos, but rather was the guarantee of human possibility and richness. I would like to have had a talk with him about that, about being a variant, and I'll bet many of you would too.
Would the panel please come forward and fill up these chairs? If anyone needs any buck stuff, I have it here. Hank Reekin has to catch a plane at 4:30, which was part of my nervousness about time. So we're going to invite him to go first. He is an NTL member who attended the first lab in Bethel in 1947.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have a chance to help celebrate the 200th anniversary of Bethel. The first time I saw Bethel, the town was a lot younger. It was only 149 years old, and for those of you who dislike doing subtraction in public, let me say that that was the year 1947. It was a day much like this, I remember it well, when we began drifting in from various places to constitute the first lab staff that was ever assembled here, or for that matter, anywhere else in the world. It was a very interesting experience to me. I was a graduate student at the time in psychology at Harvard, and having finished the first year with the aid of the GI Bill, fresh out of the U.S. Army, though we didn't always refer to it that pleasantly, I was looking forward to an interesting summer doing something else when I was approached by Ronald Lippitt, who was then a professor at MIT in the Research Center for Group Dynamics. And Ron said that there was going to be an interesting summer program that he was part of, and there might be a job for me as a research assistant. Well, the offer was good, the money was right, and I accepted without having the faintest idea of what I was getting into. In fact, the truth of the matter is none of us had the faintest idea what we were getting into. There had been some faint parallel experience the year before in a workshop that was conducted by some of the same people in New Britain, Connecticut, and you can read about that in history. I won't talk about it today, but it gave birth, that experience gave birth to the idea of a new kind of education in human relations, in sensitivity to other people's perspective and view, in awareness of one's own ability or inability to communicate and to relate. An educational experience that would be based not in being told how to do something, but learning how to do something by trying to do it. Experiential learning is another name for it. Lee Bradford always called it laboratory education, and he meant by that to indicate the experimental quality of the program. It was experiment in the roughest possible sense, however. It was genuinely cut and try. It wasn't a controlled clinical trial. It was an exploration of a new mode of thinking and doing with other people. It was the first summer was heavily overburdened with research work. We must have been 50 on the staff at the research enterprise at one time or another, recording every movement, every thought, every emotion, every idea, because we didn't know what we were looking for. All we were looking for was some kind of evidence that an educational experience was taking place. I was told off to be the anecdotal observer for the Basic Skill Training Group. Those are the names we used at the time. Run by a man named Kenneth Benny, whom I had never met. He turned out to be a charmer, always laughing and nodding and smiling, very good at leading a BST group. And when I said to him, "Now what do you want me to do?" he said, "Keep your eyes and ears open." I said, "Yes, and then?" He said, "Well, if anything interesting happens, kind of make a note of it, and we'll talk about it at the end of the session." So anecdotal observation was born. There were two or three other kinds of observers measuring interaction and emotion and so on, and plenty of people hovering around on the periphery to record what the delegates, as we called them, were doing with their time. It was an exciting time in many ways. There was, in the first place, the question of whether anyone would come. Several people had indicated that they would show up and come for this first 3-week session. A laboratory lasting 3 weeks was the common pattern. And it was considered a genuine miracle when 60 people did finally show up, having paid their fee, their dormitory room fee, and took up their places in Holden Hall or in Gearing Hall and reported the next morning for the first session of their basic skill training group. I have lots more to say about what Bethel was at the time. It was both the same and it was different. Bryant's Market was down at the corner where the Key Bank is now. Albert Cotton had a store down here on Church Street. There wasn't any Bethel Savings Bank, and the building that is much the same, well, no, it isn't. It's quite different in the exterior, was the pharmacy. Bethel was a tough place to practice substance abuse. The only drugs you could get were through the pharmacy, where the pharmacist, the Bosserman's pharmacy, where the pharmacist wore +4s, knickers, a style of trousers that had gone out of when Bobby Jones won the British Open. Beer was available if you wanted to go to Greenfield or Greenwood, and those who were terribly in need had to go to Berlin, New Hampshire for whiskey. So it was a very sedate kind of place, at least on the exterior. But Bethel always had and immediately communicated a sense of self-respect and pride. The community was remarkable in its tolerance for the flood of psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists, and other riffraff that drifted in to be the first NTL. But now that I've heard the history, I can see that the community have been conditioned by Dr. Gehring. And they must have said to themselves, "My God, what have we done to deserve it twice in a row?"
I've never talked into one of these things, and my voice sounds so awful. Maybe I should do better sitting down. No, you need it. I really need it. Look at me, you know I'm an old woman. The minute I open my mouth, you know that I'm a native. Try as I will, I've never been able to get rid of this main accent. However, I've lived away from Bethel for a great many years before I came back. So before I came back, I used to hear all of these stories about these weird NTL people around Bethel. Some people thought they were communists. They had paper parties. They had no manners. They had no manners. They went out for dinner without a coat and tie and all of those things. So of course I was very curious. Well, my family had an old house that nobody could afford to live in, and so most of the early staff all lived down in that family house. So when I got back, I said to my brother, who was a real countryman, not a sophisticate, I said, "Do tell me about these horrible people I hear about. What? Tell me about them." And he said to me, he said, "They're very good people. In fact," he said, "I think they're probably quite bright, intelligent people. But," he said, "they either don't know what they're doing, or they don't know how to explain it to anybody else. Hankins already told you all about those days when you didn't know what you were doing.
Right on.
Right. Anyway, so I thought it would be great fun to find out, and so I spent the rest of my life between NTL and Bethel. I went down and got a job and did all the different jobs in the office. I went to a lot of labs. I went through a training course. I went and was, I guess it's calling themselves facilitators now, do we? I don't know. Anyway, and I came and made speeches at opening sessions, you see. I would come down and tell NTL what Bethel didn't like about them, and then I would try to explain NTL to Bethel. And the last few years, I really don't know much that's going on, so I guess I'm establishing my credibility in case I say anything, and that's enough.
Stepford is an old friend of Bethel and NTL. A long time. How long?
Well, I can pick up a little where Hank left off. I'm a second generation Bethelese in the sense that those who started in NTL, or anyway, those who started in 1947, by the time I got here in 1950, had established themselves as legitimate crazies. And so that my own experience was, I've lived all my life in the summers on Lake Keyser, 19 miles from here. And as I was growing up, when we went away from camp, as you know, we call places like this camp if they're on a lake. When we went anywhere, being on the north end of the lake, we went sort of in this direction, and the big adventures were to Rumford. And we did that occasionally. And the other was Freiburg, where we did some shopping and things like that. And occasionally originally, first time I came was horse-drawn, but after that were some early four-wheelers. And a major adventure was to go to Bridgeton. As I left from the time I was about 15, was involved in the Second World War and so forth, came back, went back into the theater, which had been my life from the time I was 12. And I'd been in the professional theater, and I became a stage manager and director and so forth. And I came back after the war to New York, and came back, was very busy working in summer theaters in 47, 48, and so forth. Through a mutual friend, my first exposure to Bethel wasn't an exposure to Bethel at all. My wife, who was an executive in the Girl Scouts, in 1947 was visited by Marge Manning, who Henry may remember, who was a participant at that first lab. And she dropped down to see us in New York on her way back to Cincinnati, where she was the director of the Cincinnati Girl Scouts and so forth. And I had nothing to do with this sort of thing. And I heard this crazy discussion at dinner, which I left and went to bed because it seemed too bad to waste the time listening to that. A couple of years later, I was involved in, I had staged some major industrial shows, and I was involved in working with the Chicago Railroad Fair, which was in 1950, where I was the sort of program director. And again, through Ron Libet, he'd heard through a mutual friend, Phil Barber, that I was a theater director, and he was concerned, he and Lee were concerned about the general sessions, which they had twice a day, once for research and once in the evenings. And the Bethel folk frequently came to the evenings, as many of you may remember. But they were concerned that the communication wasn't as effective as they'd like, and they thought maybe if a theater person came up and studied the general sessions, I might be able to do something about improving the presentations and so forth. This sounded very interesting, although I didn't know anything about it. But I knew it was in Maine, and Maine meant that it must be somewhere near where I lived. But I was involved with the Chicago Fair, which was running down at the end of the time at the 3-week period that this program was going on here. I hadn't any idea about what this program was or about the whole idea of this type of education and so forth. So I went through a schizophrenic 3 weeks. I would leave on a Friday in my bungalow on the lot at the Chicago Fair and be driven in an open red Cadillac by a guy in a Canadian Mountie uniform to Midway Airport, where I'd catch a plane to LaGuardia, which sometimes got there, and then I'd catch another little plane to Portland. I'd have dinner with my wife in New York, and then I'd make my way, however, up to Bethel, where everybody was naked, or at least almost naked. They were all barefoot and carrying on and doing all these funny things. So I couldn't get here Sunday night for the opening, but I got here Monday morning for this so-called tea group. It would gotten to be called by then. And that year there were 6 such groups, and 2 of them were experimental. There was Alexander and Knickerbocker had developed an experimental, highly structured program where you went through studying goals or power or whatever it is. And so I went to this thing, and it seemed like fun. There were 6 of us sat around, and somebody said, how do you get along in your groups that you're with or whatever? And somebody said, how do you talk to people? And then they had a little exercise where we talked in pairs and so forth. And I thought this was wonderful. I didn't anything like the tea group that I'd heard some mystery about. That afternoon they had social action groups, because one of the lesser known things about NTL and about Bethel is that at the time, this was McCarthy days. There were very few voices in the wilderness to fight what was going on in Washington. One of those voices was some of the nuclear scientists, but the other voice were this group of social scientists from Michigan and here who came here partly, half I suppose, because they discovered this methodology of the laboratory learning in this education, but the other half was to change the world, social change, to try to fight what was going on. So in the afternoon in 50 they had social action groups, and these were by category, so that people from similar backgrounds went to these groups. But there was one bunch left over that didn't fit any of the categories. So the staff drew straws, and the loser got this group. It happened to be Lee Bradford. This group had in it the military. There were 2 admirals and a Marine colonel and an Army major, and there was a psychiatrist, the sole psychiatrist, and there were 2 nice ladies from Denver who were in adult education of some sort, and there was me from the theater. And Bradford was the trainer of this group. Well, this was an experience that's been written about by Stuart Chase and others. By the end of the 3 weeks, we had more psychiatrists sitting in the window than we had participants in the program. But and it was a very crazy group. It took us 3 weeks to make a decision, 2 weeks, to select somebody to attend the community meetings from our group. And we had votes on what would happen if we voted, and what would happen if we didn't vote, and what would happen if we came out this way, and what would happen if we came out that way. And finally, about the time of the second meeting, we couldn't wait any longer, so we selected the most neutral person, one of the ladies from Denver, who accepted, and then we crawled all over her, jumped all over her. She was in tears, and that was typical of a day in the afternoon in the non-tea group. So one of the things that Henry mentioned in terms of his being invited and my being invited, that was true from the very beginning, is there was this wonderful sense of confidence in the capacity of other people. I never in a million years would have been in this racket, except that Lee Bradford particularly, and Ron, had faith in me. And they let me do things. They let me become a trainer. They let me become a tea group trainer. None of which I was prepared in any formal way. And they really grew people, and that was very much a part of what was going on. By the time I got here, I'll say just a couple more things. In 1950, the staff was of some of the original people and a few others, a wonderful group of people, very dynamic, very volatile, very fighty, very feisty, very whatever. And we used to have planning sessions from Thursday to Sunday participants, whom we call delegates, came in on Sunday, and we would have 3 days of fighting and creating and innovating and whatever. And then the horrible Saturday arrived when the damn participants were going to arrive the next day. And we vented all the anger we could on them. The only release for the anger was, there was one hard and fast rule that wasn't democratic at all. And that was Lee Bradford and golf, as many of you know. 3:30 was the time when you could get 9 holes in if you started then. So it didn't matter what was going on. 3:30 was the time that you broke for the afternoon. If there was a staff meeting, Lee would pick up the clubs and go. We all learned very quickly that 3:30 is the time, and so you'll find the schedule today still is 1:30 to 3:30, and there is a long tradition behind that. I had the pleasure of being, I guess, the second longest tenure. I was here for 35 years without missing a summer, and obviously got to know some of you folks very well during those times. I was the administrator, had Kathy's job for a few years, and I'll tell you only one quick story, because part of the job of the administrator was to deal with problems if we had a psychiatrist on the staff most years, so that if somebody got a little rocky and so forth, there was medical help available for them and so forth. Or if people had an episode, we could sort of do something about it. Well, one year, I think it was in the early 60s, we had this person who was not very active in the group the first couple of days, and then he disappeared. And we couldn't find him anywhere. All the resources of the town were mobilized. The entire police force, and you know how large that was then, was involved in this, and we checked with Norway and Bridgeton and all the hospitals and so forth. Never did find him, and we notified some relatives, and we were really quite desperate about what to do with this. A week later, he showed up. He'd been riding on the caboose of the train to Montreal all week. He just liked cabooses. So that was one of the more interesting experiences. But during those days, I had the privilege of getting to know some of you, as many other NTLers have. And it was always, for me, a town gown place where people from the town came to many of the activities, the evening Wednesday square dances that we used to have and so forth. And people in NTL joined the town. And one of the major educational outputs for people who attended this was living in Bethel, going to the drugstore, meeting people like you during their 3 weeks here. And although it's never been written up as it should have been, I think that had almost as much impact on the people who attended as any of the other things we're talking about.
Listening to this just reminds me that for years I was an undercover agent, so to speak. When anything too drastic happened at NTL, someone would call me up and tell me, so I really know what would go on, so I could explain that to Bethel, and vice versa.
Yeah, doesn't matter.
I'm sorry I'm not an ad-libber, so I've written this down, and I hope I can read it fairly quickly for you all. As we have heard, 1947 was a memorable year for the town of Bethel, as the summer had its first peak at what turned out to be a mini-invasion of people from all over the world. The National Training Laboratory in Group Dynamics had picked this location in the foothills of the mountain for Dr. Leland Bradford and his peers to help train individuals in the art of communication. I believe it was the hope of these forefathers of personality development to train representatives from various industries, churches, state and federal agencies to find out what makes Johnny tick when involved in their respective positions. In 1950, my husband Dana and I moved to Bethel with our 4 little daughters. I really thought we were coming to a very small and quiet community where we would be pretty isolated from the big city life from which we had come. How wrong I was. Our first glimpse was of lovely ladies in their Indian saris, a few Africans wearing their tribal outfits, and delegates leading one another cautiously down the street, one supposedly blind, I presume to gain trust and confidence in his or her partner. In those days, the delegates were here for 3-week periods. You've all heard this from my predecessors here. For the basic human interaction course, which meant that many staff members, as well as delegates, brought their families with them and made a summer vacation out of it. It was a great boon for the economy of the town, as many people rented their houses, which in turn helped them financially meet their Bethel taxes and other obligations. The staff and members also became a part of the community. And not only did we entertain them, but they many times reciprocated. It was at this time that I thought that maybe a day camp for some of the visiting children would be beneficial, and therefore Camp Teepee Town became a reality. With the help of Wilbur Myers from Gould Academy, we constructed 4 authentic teepees which were scattered in the woods behind our home. 4 Native American tribes lived there, and the native lore was the theme. Our counselors were all from Bethel, and through the help of research books from the Maine State Library, we all became, quote, authorities, end of quote, on just how the Native Americans lived, ate, survived, and danced in the early days. It was a wonderful 3 years, and some of our small and young campers of those days still remember the good times we had. We had our horses for all to ride, went swimming daily, studied geology for badges taken from my husband Doug's rock mineral collection. The campers made all of their own native clothing, sang and played Native American games, and of course had special Parents' Day where they could show off their prowesses as Native Americans. Finally, in 1957, I had the opportunity to take the basic HI lab, not forget how very much the NTL has done for our community. Many people, including our daughters, have benefited from their presence, not only economically, but educationally. So hopefully they will continue to come to this small and restful town in the Valley of the Mountains. Thank you.
I'm a senior citizen, and I feel like I'm in kindergarten up here. All of this wonderful history. I have to tell you that about 3 weeks ago, in fact, exactly 3 weeks ago today, 1 month ago today, I'm losing it. I was in Egypt, and in the course of discussions with some of the people who were on tour with me, as will always happen, they want to know what you do and where you do it. And I explained what I did and how I did it and where I did do it. And NTL came up. And there was a couple on the tour, and a man said to me, "Oh, you mean the same NTL in Bethel, Maine?" And I said, "Yes, we were in Cairo, and the Ramses Hilton there." And he said, "NTL helped me become the person that I am today." In the summer of 1967, my company sent me to Bethel, Maine, to NTL. And I just happened to go with my wife and my 2 daughters and son. And at that time, I was really in the process of having difficulty with my job. And they thought it would be a good place for me to go. I was on my last leg in terms of the career that I had chosen. And I wasn't doing too well. And so I went, and it was one of the most wonderful experiences that I've ever had. Now, the young woman who was there with them, in addition to his wife, was his daughter. And of course, she's in New York and with the Metropolitan Opera right now. But she was a little girl then. And they came as a family and stayed here that summer. He came for the President's Lab and took several others. Ironically, 2 years later was my first trip to Bethel. And I don't have as many years as Dick, but I missed one summer. And that was the summer of '74, since that time. And I took off a summer to marry a guy that I'd met the year before, and here, and he will be here in a couple of days, and we will be celebrating our 23rd wedding anniversary. And we met here in Bethel, as did many others. And I heard Barbara talking of, speaking of the Nigerians who had been here, and others mention people of color who had been through Bethel. Well, I think some of you remember that the summer I came up was the summer after you had had an eventful summer. And a person who loves Bethel dearly had been one of the few participants who were people of color that summer, Fred Miller. And I came the summer after. And as much as people were used to having diversity in the Bethel community, you know, all it takes is one little twig being broken, and somehow we look at things and people in a different way. Well, that summer I came up, I was the only person in that particular time who looked like me. And Fred had been up here, and somehow things had not gone so well for him that summer, and so here I come. And I have to tell you that it was a summer of anticipation for Bethel, because I didn't know what had gone on yet, until someone explained. And with all of the wonderful things and opportunities that had happened in Bethel over several years, this happened to be in the midst of the civil rights movement. And so, you know, you drop your net wherever you are. And so those people of color who were here that summer before me dropped their nets wherever they were. I was on vacation. I was resting, you see. I was resting from several events of dropping my net wherever I was. And so it was wonderful to get up here in the woods. But I want to tell you that in the 23 years that I've spent coming to Bethel, I'm forever amazed at the change. The summer of 88, all I did was walk the streets and cry the first day I was here. Because you see, I had spent 15 years living at the Norseman, and it was no longer there as my home. And it was very painful. To come back on several summers and find that people that I'd grown very close to were no longer here. They had just been buried the day before or something, having passed on during the winter. One of the greatest joys that I have had coming to Bethel, on my first 1 or 2 days, I want to tell you, it's a ritual. The first thing that I do is I drop in at Prim's, and it's still Prim's to me. I know that David has changed his name, and to order my globe. Then the next thing I do is I go to the bank, and then to the grocery store. I just want to know who's here, or the people that I like, I love, and that I've grown accustomed to over the years. Are they still here? And what are they doing? And how are their lives? And I get the same kinds of questions. So to me, NTL and Bethel are intricately woven in a way where the personal lives of people. I want to tell you, I don't know anybody that I love and know anymore than I do Diane Cross, who worked for NTL for 13 or 14 years, and she's my friend. And for many, many years that I've been here, she's a personal friend. A Jackie Visa, a Barbara Brown. Many, many people. I could talk about the labs. I think you've heard a lot about those things, and our history and the kind of training that we do. A few years ago, 4 or 5, I think many of you know, when NTL considered leaving Bethel, again, it was a day that I cried. It was a very painful day for me. And you know, you don't just stand still if you want things done. And so I called and I begged and I cried. And then we got busy, Gwyneth and a lot of other Bethelites, and talked in a way that said, it wasn't just about the training that had gone on here for 40 years or so. What it was about, after so much time, is the depth and the integrity of relationships that are forged out of experiences and struggles that might have started with a trust walk. I think that experience is probably the thing that's most symbolic of NTL in Bethel. If you ask anybody, they'll say, well, those are the people who walk with their eyes blindfolded with somebody leading them. But that it's more than the trust walk, if you will. Except that the trust walk is probably symbolic of the journey that NTL and the community of Bethel have been on for nigh unto 50 years. And that journey is what endurance and trust and love and perseverance and the richness of spirit that Bethel gives to NTL and NTL gives to Bethel. Yes, we have laboratory education here in Bethel. And yes, NTL hopefully will be here a long, long time. But the roots run deep and the stream runs wide in terms of what possibilities there are for these two structures, organizations, to continue a lifelong experience. I'm on the board of directors now. I have my second stand, and there probably won't be another. But the one thing that I hope that I, as a board member, that I've left in Washington and here, is a legacy that will ensure good times, good friends, and something that feels often very much like family. Thank you.
I'm going to talk mainly about my business experience with NTL, but believe me, I've had some wonderful years with NTL, a lot of fun stuff too. But I'll start, and I won't talk very long. I was hired as a stenographer by Wilbur Myers in 1951 and continued working in the NTL administrative office until 1965. Eileen Waldy and Bob Luke were my mentors. While Eileen was a hard taskmaster and often had me in tears, she helped me grow and learn a great deal about the behavioral sciences. Our office then was located behind the Gould Library. After the first summer or two, I started doing secretarial work for Lee Bradford and continued this role until I retired in 1965. Every September, the administrative office was moved to the conference center right here, where the key executive conference was held in the fall. Here I worked with audiovisual persons, Herb Morton, George Eiper, but there were also others. For 6 years, I helped set up the NTL administrative offices elsewhere, at Absecon, New Jersey, Arden House in New York, and Samoset. A secretary would come on from Washington and I came from Bethel. If Lee was on the staff, I always did his typing. The last work I did for Lee was a 9-month stint at home, typing the history of NTL, 1947 to 1970, which was done in this manner, very old-fashioned. Lee would mail his handwritten work, which was extremely difficult to read. I would type the material on stencils and return them to Washington. That's the end of it. I also worked for Ken Benny along with Lee. And I wanted to say that our garden was open to staff or participant wives with whom we shared our produce while they were here.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Do you have any questions for each other? If not, we'll move out to the audience. Do you have any questions, comments, memoirs, anything to add to the lore of NTL and Bethel? Phyllis.
They were bit by flies.
Haven't been able to get rid of those in 50 years.
You stole my thing. The thing that has happened in Bethel and still does are mosquitoes in the spring. One of the things I wanted to say is that NTL has probably been the best education I ever had. The first group that I had joined, I was totally innocent, this kind of thing. And one day somebody said something and I wound up crying. He said, "You are so corny." So when I went outside during the break and I had myself a good cry, and then all of a sudden I said to myself, "So what?" I suppose I'm still a little corny, but that's all right too. But it's been a wonderful education for me and many others that I know. And as a matter of fact, I did a lot of work with social work in the Head Start program, which, by the way, is one of my favorite programs in the United States. If they ever stop that, I'll embrace the dickens. I won't be corny either. And I was working in New Hampshire as a social services coordinator. That was Tri-County. There were 3 counties. Boy, did I rack up the mileage. Anyway, they started a new program in New Hampshire, which calls the School of Lifelong Learning. It was affiliated with the University of New Hampshire. And as a result of it, I went there, and I was able to get credits for my work with NTL, my participation in NTL. As a matter of fact, I co-trained with one of the professors and got my degree in human relations from the University of New Hampshire. So I'm still corny, but I still get a better education from it. It was wonderful. Someone else?
Yes.
Brian Stoll.
Well, I have a really different perspective of NTL growing up as a townie and sort of being on the outside looking in. I just saw it as a sort of a source of entertainment, summer entertainment. And to give you an example of that, there wasn't a lock made that I couldn't get off the beer cooler in there. One of the most deep things I remember a participant in NTL saying is, "Who made off with my 6-pack of Peels?" This was the way a lot of us kids looked at this place, as just a place of mischief. But then I began to see the value in NTL. I started dating Ron's daughter Martha Lippett and Toby Rizel. But I just want to say that that's what it meant to a lot of us kids when we were growing up. I also had a cultural lesson. I remember my first cultural lesson. A friend of mine and I were walking down the street when we were about 11 years old, and nobody in Bethel wore name tags in the summertime. Now, who walks around wearing name tags? Now your bathroom attendants have name tags. But so we immediately could peg the NTLers, and there was a man walking down the street with a name tag, R-A-M-O-N. We said, "Hi, Raymond, how are you doing?" And he said, "Ramon." Huh? Ramon. So we said, "Ramon." He said, "Good, very good. How are you doing?" Well, that was my first friend, probably, of color that I made. So NTL, just from an outside observer looking in, it was just a source of fun, a source of diversity. crashing the parties up here. It's just lots of fun. And the sad thing is, as an adult, I lost contact with it. And that's one of the reasons I came here today, is sort of maybe try to reestablish some contact. Thank you.
Thank you.
Someone else?
Yes. You've got to stay right there, Gwyneth, so that I know where we are. Gwyneth, I moved here in 1960, and everybody warned me that I wouldn't see anybody until September that I would really see, except they came in for a coffee party. And that's the way life was. It was very, there weren't many of the young town wives around. However, I think it was about 63 that Carolyn Brooks and I started to be liaison through the chamber with the social person from Beth Harvey, it was at the time, from NTL. And of course there were in our neighborhood a lot of families like the Campbells and the Lippets and so forth, so that we were kind of inundated around with a lot of people to meet. Peg Lippet came over and practiced cross-age tutoring, just experimenting with one of my boys. And the interesting thing about it, though, to me, was that I met so many people because we were halfway between the academy grounds and the drugstore. And there was a good place for somebody who was just about ready to lose it to sit down on the doorstep and have a good cry and figure out whether he or she could go back in the afternoon. So, in all seriousness, I felt it upon a pat. But one of the funniest things that ever happened, I'm not a gardener. I just let Sam do what he wants to do about flowers, and maybe they'll grow. However, one day, one of those people came in, and she was not about to cry. She was angry, and she was ventilating very heavily. And she said, "You don't know anything about flowers. What are you doing to these poor plants?" And she said, "You don't know who's talking to you." But she said, "I know about flowers." And she said, "It's just ridiculous what you're doing." So somebody told me after, I think Peg Lippet informed me, that probably that was the person who was editor of one of the gardening magazines and so forth. But, if you get funny things over the years. And then one summer after we were in business, a young man came in one day. On his first day there. We don't usually see them in between. We see them first day of the last day, and sometimes it used to on the Wednesday afternoon when they had it off. But this man came in and he was very serious about wanting some pieces from Sam's shop. And 2 days later he came in, wanted to know what the bill was going to be and what the shipping would be and so forth. And we said, "Well, aren't you going to take them with you when you go?" Because we thought he had his own vehicle with him. And he said, "Well, I'm going today." He said, "This is the end for me. I'm going." And that was the only one that we knew about who really didn't get by our house and decided to stay. But we presume there were others. But over the years, it certainly was an important part of the community. And I think I felt very badly, I know I did, when we went through this "we're going to leave" thing. It just was unreal. And so, that's part of my story.
Thank you.
Oh, one more thing I do want to say. When the discussion was going on about who would be on the panel today, no matter who is mentioned, there's always somebody else that you can think of. But I think it's just worked out wonderfully, and I've enjoyed all of you.
Anybody else? Here's the one who sees all the bodies.
I know I'm kind of a youngster coming up here, but NTL is how I started my business. Basically, I was familiar with NTL about 15 years ago when I did a Peace Corps training in Washington, D.C., and I was so amazed by the process that the people who were facilitating they were phenomenal, and they were NTL. And I said, well, one day I've got to get involved with this place. And then I landed in Bethel, and I was with Outward Bound, and there were scholarships for locals to attend labs. So I took up the advantage and did my first HI lab about 5 years ago. And at the end of that 7 days of incredibleness, I walked out with a sense of, I had a self-confidence and a sense of energy that I had never felt before, and I said, well, I better capture on this. So I went around, and immediately I got out at 12 noon, and at 2 o'clock I was knocking on doors to find a job. And the events went about that. I got my office, and everything fell into place, and now I get to work with NTL people one-on-one, and it's an incredible opportunity for me, and I very much appreciate it, on top of the lovely people that are just the locals that live here. So I appreciate the NTL people, and it sounds pretty cool when I can say a client just called from England to book their appointment, so in advance. So I really appreciate you.
I had decided to ignore the threat to leave and took it out of my talk. I'm glad it got fed back in.
I'm here as a participant. I just wanted to share with all of you that I feel it's a real privilege to be able to come here, and that I'm really glad I was here this week when you had the lawn party, so that I could be part of it and hear about the history and just see it all happen. And I'm really glad that I was here, and just thank you.
Hi, I'm also here as a participant, and when I first had the opportunity to take an NTL lab back in 1992, I kept asking people, what is it about it, and what's so special and what's so different? And the answer was, we're not going to tell you, just go. Just go and you'll see, you'll find out yourself. And I did. 4 years ago, I went to AHI lab, and then since then, I heard a comment earlier today that it was the best education I've ever had, and that really rang true with me, because I really believe that it was, and it's really helped set a foundation for future education. I took 2 other NTL labs since then, and what I started hearing was, well, yeah, NTL is great, but NTL and Bethel are also truly special. And I said, well, what is it about Bethel that's so special? We're not telling you, you just got to go. So that's what I did. I came up here, and I'm truly glad I did, because I appreciate the specialness of this town, and I've had a great few days, and I look forward to another couple more great days here. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Anything else from the panel? It truly gave us a wonderful picture, a historic picture, and a present, and the perspective means a lot to all of us. There are refreshments over here. We hope you'll continue to exchange stories among yourselves, and that you'll spend your time not NTL with NTL, but Bethel with Bethel, but Bethel with NTL, and NTL with Bethel.
After you said that, I did think of something, because I think that there is we've heard people who took labs who were Bethelites, people who came to Bethel.
There's another dimension to the NTL Bethel story, and that is that there are 2 different roads traveled that connect Bethel and NTL. One is that many members, several members anyway, of NTL have come to the community and decided that they wanted to spend more time than the 1 or 2 weeks. And so they bought homes here. And I think of 2 in particular, the Seashores, who live in the Bingham House when they are in residence here, and Donald Coverdale, who lives down on Vernon Street, were members of NTL before they bought property in Bethel. In the area, and this is probably the members of the Bethel community probably know all of this, and then there are people who return every year, of course, Dick Beckhart was coming here before we were here as an organization. But people like Nancy Brown Jameson, who's up on the lake and returns every year. But then there's another group, and that group of people are members of the Bethel community, who were members of the Bethel community and became members of NTL. And we have several of those. And so probably those of you who live in the community know that, but there are people who are participants here and who may be members who don't know that we have several members who are members of NTL, and they are also members of the Bethel community, some a long time. We have Dr. Patricia Williams, who is an NTL member. Gwyneth Bohr is an NTL member. Jackie Visa, who is not here today, I don't believe, is an NTL member. Did I miss anybody else?
John Shore.
John Shore is an NTL member. And these were people who lived here, went through the rigors of the training that NTL...
Today's program is about the relationship between the Bethel community and the National Training Laboratories. This is our 200th year celebration. It is the 50th summer that NTL has been here, but